What sparked the Maccabean revolt?
The story of Hanukkah is usually simplified, one should say perhaps overly simplified, and presented in the following manner. The Greeks were very nasty and persecuted the Jews, religiously and otherwise. The Jews revolted, and despite the odds that were certainly not in their favor, they won. And that is the story of Hanukkah, and that is what we celebrate. The other aspect of Hanukkah that is actually stressed even more than what we just mentioned is the return to the Mikdash, the temple, and the lighting of the menorah with oil that should not have lasted for more than one day, and lasted for 8 days. And these are the essential points of Hanukkah. For most Jews, certainly most religious Jews, Hanukkah is more about the oil than anything else. And even those who do speak about the historical events, those which are in fact mentioned in the prayers that we recite during Hanukkah, such as the addition to the tefillah, to the standing prayer, to Birkat HaMazon, grace after meals, Al Hanisim, where we speak explicitly about the milhamoth and the yeshuoth, we speak about the war and the victory against our enemies. The true nature of those events is generally not known or misunderstood. The story begins with the expansion of the Macedonian and Greek Empire eastward, all the way up to the borders of India by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great ruled from the year 336 to the year 323 BCE, when he died as a young man, apparently in his 30s. He possibly died of alcohol poisoning, simply drinking too much. It's also possible he was poisoned by his enemies, generals, or he simply died of some disease which was not uncommon. The truth is no one knows for sure. But when Alexander the Great died, his immense empire was divided amongst a number of his generals. We shall focus here on two areas of the former united empire of Alexander. One known as the Ptolemaic kingdom, which was centered in Egypt, its capital being Alexandria, and the Seleucid kingdom, being to the north, that is to say, controlling parts of Turkey, what today is Syria, Lebanon, and Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. Eretz Israel was in the hands of the Ptolemaic kingdom, the southern kingdom in Egypt, till the year 198 BCE, for approximately 125 years. There was constantly tension and fighting between these two kingdoms, and at that time control of most of Eretz Israel was wrested away from the Ptolemies and grabbed by the Seleucids. But it should be understood that whether it was the Ptolemies reigning from Egypt or the Seleucids ruling from Syria, the land of Israel and the Jewish people were living for a very long period of time under Greek influence. So for a period of approximately 250 years, up until the time of the Maccabean revolt, the Jewish people living in their homeland had been experiencing what we refer to today as Hellenic culture, civilization. Alexander and the Greeks in general were of the opinion that their culture, their way of doing things was superior, and they were doing everyone a great favor by bringing their culture to the other nations. This, of course, included the Jewish nation. The Jewish populace of Eretz Yehudah, the land of Judea, was basically divided into two categories. You had the majority, who were farmers, lived off the land, in the hinterland, not on the coast, in the hills of Judea, in the plain below those hills. The vast majority of the population, probably something like 70%, was completely Jewish and traditional in their way of life, in their belief system. They were completely committed to the Torah of their forefathers, and they tried to have as little to do as possible with the Greco-Syrians. Another section of the population, perhaps 30%, lived in the coastal cities and in Jerusalem. This included the wealthier classes, the great merchants, the people who were involved in facilitating the Greco-Syrian rule over Judea. They received very lucrative positions such as tax farming, which is a tremendous moneymaker in those days. One had to promise to the king to deliver a certain amount of taxation from a certain area of the country, but you could of course extort anything above and beyond that amount, and that would be all yours. That would be entirely profit. And there were many Jews who thrived under this system, and they wished to be as similar to their Greco-Syrian masters and overlords as possible. The expression which we find in the Mishnah in Masechet Avot, speaking about he who is mefer berito shel Avraham Avinu, he who wishes to undo, as it were, the berith, the covenant of Avraham Avinu, referring to the berith milah, referring to the circumcision. This was an operation, a very primitive, crude kind of operation, which was also dangerous and very painful, whereby a Jew who had been circumcised wished to have a foreskin reattached to his male member in order to look more like his Greek master, so he could participate in their sporting events where it was the form to be naked, etc. They also began to dress and worship like the Greeks. All of this led to much tension within the Jewish people and to two very clearly defined camps or factions within the Jewish people: the Hellenists and the traditionalists. The Greco-Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes, known as Epiphanes, which literally means the expression of or revelation of the deity, of the divine, an indication of how vain and reckless he was as an individual, the son of Antiochus III. So this was Antiochus IV, came to the throne in the year 175 BCE. And for reasons which have everything to do with internal rivalries within the Jewish people, within Yerushalayim, within the city of Yerushalayim, struggles regarding who would be the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest, who would be able to pay more bribe, a higher bribe, and promise more material benefits to this new ruler. For these reasons, a faction of these Hellenist Jews decided to approach the king. And it relates in the first book of the Maccabees, the first chapter. Bayomim hahem yasa'u min kharav Yisrael b'nei v'li'al. At that time, there were from amongst the Jewish people b'nei v'li'al. This term b'nei v'li'al refers to Hellenized Jews, Jews who turned their back on the Torah, those that we refer to in the bracha in the Shmoneh Esrei, in the tefillah, the standing prayer, the silent prayer, as Meshumadim or Minim and Posheim. وَيَدِّحُ رَبِيم لَمُور, and they turned to many of their fellow Jews and said, نَلَخَا وَنِخْرَثَا وَرِيثْ أَتَا گويim. Let us conclude a pact and let us walk in the ways of these non-Jews who rule over us, asher savivotenu, these people around us, ki min hayom asher sarnu mi'imaham musaunu ra'uth raboth, because from the day that we separated ourselves from the other nations and became a unique Jewish nation with a unique culture and civilization, from that day to this we have only suffered great calamities and tragedies. It is interesting to note that the claims of these people on the one hand, and the claims of the traditionalists, the loyal Jews, loyal to the Torah and the ways of their forefathers, those who wish to live according to Jewish tradition, their claims were diametrically opposed. The Hellenists claimed that all our problems are due to the fact that we are different from the non-Jews, that we insist on being different and separate. The Torah Jews, of course, claim the opposite, that all our problems stem from the fact that we are trying to emulate the non-Jews and not be who we truly are supposed to be. We are trying to run away from our way of life, from our culture. We are not being authentic and loyal to Hashem and His Torah, and this is the cause of all our problems. So these two camps presented precisely opposite theses as to why the Jewish people found themselves in less than an ideal situation. And they went to the king, and because they were willing to pay and able to pay, because they represented the wealthy classes, the people who had been collaborating with the Greco-Assyrians for generations, they were able to promise much more in terms of taxes and money and what have you to the king and his advisors. They received his permission to institute a program of Hellenization in the land of Judea, in Eretz Yehuda, and more specifically and beginning with Yerushalayim, with Jerusalem. And they built a gymnasium, what was called a gymnasium, which was a place where only men, women were not allowed at such places or such events. Men would engage in various sports and wrestling and other kinds of activities. Some of those activities are practiced to this day at the Olympic Games, also a Greek invention, of course. And this was all done, one had to be naked. This was done whilst being naked, and you could not really participate if you were circumcised. This was viewed as an abomination by the Greeks. They considered circumcision to be a kind of mutilation of the human form, the exact opposite of how the Jews viewed this thing. And that's why it goes on to say here in the book of Maccabean, the first book of the Maccabees, وَيَعَصُوا لَهَمْ عُرْلًا. So they were willing even to undergo, if necessary, surgical intervention to create for themselves a foreskin. وَيَعَزْفُوا وَرِيثْ كَوْدَشْ وَيَثَمَدُوا لَغَوْيِمْ. And they wished to emulate the non-Jews in every respect. وَيَثْمَكَرُوا لَعَصَوْ ثُرَى. And doing that which is considered evil and wrong and inappropriate according to the Jewish people, but considered laudable and most appropriate by the Hellenized Jews and by the Greeks themselves, they completely adopted this way of life. And it goes on to state, وَيِكْتَبْ هَمَّلَخْ الْكُلْ مَلْخُفَوْ لِيَوْتْ كُلَامْ لَعَمْ أَهَدْ. There was a royal decree that all people had to accept the state religion and behave like Greeks. وَلَعَزَوْ كُلْ إِيشَ الْحُكُثَوْ وَيِكَبْلُوا خُلْ هَعَمِيمْ كِدْوَارْ هَمَلَخْ. And each group, each ethnic group must relinquish its practices and traditions and adopt the Hellenized ways. And it states explicitly that there are many Jews who are willing to go along with this, many of them very happily. وَرَبِّim مِيِسْرَائِيل رَثُوا بَعْوَدَثُوا وَيِزْبَحُوا لَإِلِهِمْ. Many Jews were interested in doing this very thing, and they were willing to offer sacrifices to the Greek gods, وَيَحَلَّلُوا الشَّبَّاث, and they were quite happy to desecrate the Shabbat. And the text continues, وَبَحْمِشَعَ السَّرْيَوْمْ بِخِسْلَوْ, the 15th day of the month of Kislew, in the winter, the beginning of the winter. بَحَمَشْ وَأَرْبَعِيمُ مِئَةَ شَنَةٍ, in the year 145 according to the Greco-Syrian calendar, known amongst the Jews as Minyan Shetaroth. Banu Shiqus Meshomem ala Mizbeah, the Hellenized Jews went so far as to desecrate the Mikdash, the temple. They erected an idol, Greek idol, ala Mizbeah, on the altar. Uva'ara Yuda misaviv banu vamoth, and the word was given to build altars for this purpose also in the various towns and villages of Eretz Yuda, the land of Judea. This campaign began with the erection of this massive idol to Zeus, the Greek god, in the Mikdash, in the temple. This was in the year 167 BCE. And other decrees, including burning Sifrei Torah, to eradicate Judaism, basically, outlawing Brit Milah, circumcision, and keeping Shabbat, etc. All these decrees and persecutions were announced and also enforced. And one of the decrees was that in every town, every Jewish town, even in the Jewish hinterland, which had been predominantly traditionalist and had kept itself separate from the Hellenist trends in other parts of the country, each town would have to erect such an altar and sacrifice a pig to the Greek god, what we call in Hebrew, in halachic terminology, avodah zarah, foreign worship. And eventually this policy was enforced by Greco-Syrian soldiers who went from town to town enforcing this decree, and they eventually arrived in the city of Modi'in. It should be noted that even before this, there had been essentially civil war already had broken out before this time in Yerushalayim, even before the erection of that idol in the Mikdash. At that time, when some of the Jews, some factions had wished to have one of their own number appointed as Kohen Gadol, as high priest, and others had opposed this because they knew that this other person, if he were to be high priest, he would be a Hellenist and he would do exactly what eventually did in fact happen, and idols would be erected in the Mikdash. There had in fact been fighting and bloodletting in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem and other parts of the country, and now the policy was making its way into the hinterland, and they arrived in the town of Modi'in. Modi'in is a town halfway between Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv of today, roughly. This was a traditionalist town, apparently with a large population of Kohanim, of priests, and the head of one of these extended families of priests was the well-known figure Matityahu, Mattathias. And being the most respected individual in the town, he was expected to perform this sacrifice. But he refused, which itself was a tremendous act of bravery and courage. He could have been executed on the spot. And he announced, وَيَعَنْ مَتِثْيَاهُ وَيَوْمَرْ بِقَوْلْ גדול עם כל העמים אשר בבית המלכות שומעים לו, even if all the people and all the nations choose to follow the king's decrees, وَأَنِي وَبَنَاي وَأَحَي نَلَخْ بِبْرِيث أَبُوثَيْنُ, but I and my sons and my brothers, we shall follow in the ways of our forefathers, we shall follow the Torah. The essential matter and issue was living according to the Torah or not. And the point had now been reached where it was no longer possible to live as a Jew. The choice for Torah true Jews was to become traitors to their own beliefs and to their traditions and become Hellenized Jews like many others, or, if necessary, to die as Jews. That was the choice. But to live as a Jew in peace was no longer an option. So they turned, the Greek authorities turned to another prominent Jew and asked him to do the honors. And he agreed. And Matityahu, seeing this, Matityahu was overtaken by a spirit of jealous indignation and a will to prevent this desecration from occurring. And he slaughtered the Jew who had been willing to do the sacrifice. And then he went on to kill the officer in charge of the detail of Greek soldiers who had come to the town, and destroyed the altar that had been built. And he announced, all those who wish to remain loyal to Hashem and His Torah, follow me. This was the beginning of the revolt. And the first victim of the Maccabean revolt was a Jew, a Hellenized Jew, or one at least willing to bend to the will of the authorities, of the government of the day. He was the first victim, the first official victim, at least recorded here in Sefer Maccabean, of this revolt. I mentioned before there had been fighting and bloodletting between the various factions prior to this time, but we don't have details exactly about what occurred. Here we have precise details. And he and his family's extended family, and many others apparently as well, they fled the city because it was obvious that now they would be hunted down by the authorities. And that is how they began to live in hiding, in the hills, in caves. And this is how the revolt, this revolt eventually became a war against the Greco-Syrian authorities. But it was at the same time, throughout, a civil war amongst the Jews, between those who wished to remain loyal Jews and live according to the Torah, and those who wished to essentially become Gentiles. And the book of Maccabees continues and relates that this band of people began to grow under the leadership of Matityahu and his sons. And they began to arm themselves. This is a reference to the leaders of the Hellenized faction of Jews within the country. They began by attacking them, not the Greeks. They first expressed their anger and outrage and defended themselves by attacking and killing the Jews who were collaborating with their enemies, with the Greco-Syrian authorities, who were trying to force them to abandon the Torah, abandon being Jewish. That is, the Rishaim and the Poshaim referred to here are precisely those people. That is why we find in some versions of the Al-Hanisim prayer that the Hellenized Jews are referred to as Poshaim, exactly the word used here. And those who were able to escape, those Hellenized Jews who opposed their policies, these traditionalist Jewish policies, they fled to centers of government where they were protected by the Greeks. Matityahu, who was still at this time the head of the rebellion, they moved throughout the country, destroying all the Greek altars that had been erected in every town and village. وَيَمُولُ اَثَ بَنِيمْ أَشَلُونِ مَولُ. And they made it their business to check wherever they went. They examined all the young Jewish boys to see if they had been circumcised. أَشَرْ مَسَئُوا بِغْفُولِ يِسْرَائِلْ بِحُزْكَى. Any child who was found to be not circumcised, they did so, if necessary, by force. They circumcised all the Jewish boys, some of whom had not been circumcised because of fear of these decrees, because it relates earlier in the book that a mother who was found with a Jewish child, a baby, who had been circumcised, it says, وَأَثَنَشِمْ أَشَرْ مَرُوا أَثْ بَنَيْهِمْ هِمِثُوا عَلْ پِيَ پِكُودَا. Women, mothers of babies who were found circumcised, were put to death, and their children were hung by the neck, as is related previously. This was the manner in which the revolt began. Only later did it become a more extended and lengthy guerrilla war between an ever-growing Jewish army and the Greco-Syrian forces. It should also be noted that this has always been the case within the Jewish people. There have always been those who wished to abandon the Torah, abandon our traditions, cease being a separate and very different nation with a very distinct and separate culture, and simply adopt the ways of the nations around about. We see this in the period of the First Temple, the Mikdash HaRishon, and we see this down to the present day. If we look in Sefer Yirmiyahu, the book of Jeremiah, for example, in the second chapter, Pasuk Lamed Gimel, verse 33, Ma tetivi darkech levakesh ahava, lachen gam et horaoth limadt et dorachaich. Here, Yirmiyahu and many other pasukim in this, many other verses in these chapters, speaks of how many of the Jews wanted nothing more than to adopt the ways of the Assyrians and other nations round about, not to be different. In the Targum Yonathan, the Aramaic translation of that pasuk, Ma tiktivi darkech levakesh ahava, why do you try to doll yourself up and be like the Gentiles, and you seek ahava, literally love? How does Yonathan ben Uziel translate this in the ancient Aramaic translation? Ma'at mishtapera ba'or. Why do you dress yourself up? L'ithabara la'amamaya, to attach yourself to the other nations. The problem of the Jewish people has always been, the major problem has always been the desire of some of the people to relinquish their Jewish identity and simply forget that they were ever Jews and become like other nations. But Hashem promises throughout the Tanakh, we find this stated again and again, that this will never happen. The Jewish people will always remain attached to the Torah, even if some fall by the wayside. The essential core, the beating heart of the Jewish people will remain completely committed to Hashem and His Torah, and eventually will always come out victorious.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.